Hey guys, we're ready to do part 3 of our ecosystems unit. Let me remind you, an ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic factors that interact in a particular environment. You should all be really comfortable with that. Okay. So the focus of section 3 is limiting factors. Limiting factors are the resources that affect the size and the health of populations in an ecosystem. Those limiting factors also cause competition or fighting between populations and among populations. We also need to look at that. Okay, so let's start with the sun. Now, not all limiting factors are abiotic. They may be biotic as well, and we'll look at some of both. So the sun, we know from our study of photosynthesis that all food energy comes from sunlight. It originates with the sun. So plants, through the process of photosynthesis, are able to produce chemical energy using the radiant energy from the sun. Okay. Now, let's look at this from the other direction. So what does a mountain lion eat? Probably white-tailed deer is one thing. Sorry, that's a Mr. Eric photo. Okay. And so that deer, before it died, it fed on plants, right? And the grass that the deer ate to get its energy, that grass got the energy to make glucose from the sun. Okay. So let's think about how the sun as a limiting factor can affect an ecosystem. Okay. For example, in a desert ecosystem, it's a lot of sun. It's not that it's limited so much, is that the amount of sun limits the types of populations that can grow there, especially plant producers, right? Because there's too much sun. So they have to have special adaptations. They have to be special types of producers to be able to survive in that environment. And then maybe we have a cave ecosystem. Well, the sunlight doesn't even penetrate very far into the cave. And so, of course, you're not going to have producers when you get back up into the cave because there's no sunlight for them to use to do photosynthesis. And then you might have this prairie grassland area, and it needs just the right amount of sun. If it didn't have enough sun, then it wouldn't be able to grow as well because it couldn't do photosynthesis that it needs for the energy which it needs to grow and develop. But it also might have too much and it would dry it out. The plants would lose too much water and they would wither and die. Okay. Another limiting factor is food. Now, sometimes food is plants and sometimes food is other animals, right? So, for example, with this wolf population that feeds on deer, if we're talking about deer in Indiana, so like this time of year when the corn is growing in summer and fall, the deer are really happy. They've got plenty of food to eat themselves, right? But in the winter, after the corn has been harvested and there's nothing for them to eat, then they might start to get sick and a lot of them might start to die. So the population would decrease. And when that population decreases, then the deer as a limiting factor of food for the wolves becomes an issue, right? So the wolf population might be affected. Another limiting factor is space. There's not always enough space for all the organisms in a particular ecosystem or environment. Okay, for example, the seals in this picture, there's just not enough space for all of them to breed. And so there are fights or competition over available space. And what ends up happening is that some of the seals don't actually breed and reproduce. They don't bear young because they didn't have the space for breeding. And so that will definitely affect the population numbers of the seal population. Okay. Another limiting factor, very, very common limiting factor, is water. In some ecosystems, water is limitless or it feels limitless. In some, it is limited. Okay. So, for example, in this ocean environment, the water is not really limited, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. And look at this ecosystem. This is an oasis in the middle of the desert. And so water is definitely a limiting factor here because there's only so much available. So some A certain number of plants and trees will be able to grow. A certain number of animals can be supported in this ecosystem, but the amount of water will definitely limit the populations and how big the populations are and how healthy the populations are. Okay, let's think about this. If you have this watering hole that is the only watering hole for a week on foot in any direction, so it's like surrounded by savanna, there's no other water available. How do you think a predator like this one might use that limited water? Well, what he's going to do, he's going to sit there and wait because he knows that the animals are going to come to drink eventually, and it's going to be an easy pickings for for this guy. He's going to be able, or she, going to be able to get food because that water is a limiting factor for those populations, and it's going to force those populations of giraffe and zebra and things like that to come to the water. Okay, another limiting factor is oxygen and or carbon dioxide, depending on the organism. One or both is required by almost every life form, and it's usually unlimited except in some extreme environments. I want you to think about the water testing that we did and look at this, this swamp. How much oxygen do you think is in this water? And we'll talk about this a little bit in class too. Okay. All right, another example of an extreme environment would be one of these deep sea vents or hydrothermal vents that are deep underwater in the ocean. And in most of these hydrothermal vent ecosystems, there are a type of bacteria we call anaerobic bacteria because they live in oxygen-free environments. So they don't live with oxygen. They can't survive. And they also are producers, but there's no light because we're talking deep underwater. So the light from the sun cannot penetrate that deeply into the water. And so they have developed a process called chemosynthesis, which allows them to make their own food energy, chemical energy, through a process that's very similar to photosynthesis, but it's not light that provides the energy. I wonder what that is. We're going to look at that some more too. Okay, and based on what we studied with the water testing, when you think about dissolved oxygen levels, because there's oxygen in water, even though we can't breathe underwater, fish can. So if you have an ocean ecosystem that has a lot of dissolved oxygen in the water, it's going to look like this one. It's going to have really healthy coral, anemones, things like that. It's going to have a lot of fish. But if you have an ocean ecosystem with very little oxygen, it's going to look like the one on the bottom here, okay? Because these organisms cannot survive without oxygen. And even these deep sea fish, that live, at really great depths, they are able to live in these low oxygen environments because their bodies are adapted. Their bodies are a little bit different from the fish that you would find in shallow seas. Another limiting factor would be shelter. In most ecosystems, there's usually not enough shelter for every organism. So how many raccoons do you think can live in this one hollow log? Probably just one, right? And even if a mother raccoon has babies, when those baby raccoons get to a certain age, she's going to kick them out and tell them to go find their own shelter, okay? In a rainforest, when we start cutting down rainforests or even deciduous forests or like temperate forests, it reduces the amount of shelter that's available, and so the population of populations starts to decrease. See how I use that word two different ways, all right? Okay, so that was limiting factors. I will put this presentation on Classroom as well so that you can look back through it. And these are the things we're going to be doing in class. We're going to look at the Smithsonian video that has to do with volcanic winter that I mentioned. We'll also be looking at some of those hydrothermal vent ecosystems and chemosynthesis in particular to help you understand that. And then you will start applying what you understand about limiting factors to your ecosystem. And you will be looking at competition specific to your ecosystem. All right, so I hope that you learned a lot, and have a great evening.